Hi there. Well, you've got to put up with me again because I'm chairing this session, which is on closing the gap, and that's why you've come. Before I kick off, and the way we're going to do it is I'm going to ask each in turn to present for about 5 minutes. We'll get just a question for each, one question. So have a good think about what you might ask. And then when we've done all three, we'll have a series of comments, questions, Kicking it off, before I introduce John, who deserves a medal, at least, for pursuing the pupil premium issue, so that he must know every train route in the United Kingdom. But before I kicking it off, I kind of am not too sure about closing the gap. I never have been, really. I'm interested it's raising the floor. It's the title of this thing. I don't want to put a limit on what people can achieve. So all I'm concerned is that people shouldn't be left behind, unable to lead fulfilled lives and in the process contribute to the fulfillment of others. And I therefore worry about the notion of closing the gap, but I don't worry about the mechanics of, well, what do we do to make sure that every youngster has a chance to unlock their mind and shut chambers of the heart, as somebody once put it. But John, straight over to you. He needs no introduction. John will give the presentation and tell you what he's been up to.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Tim. And my short answer to the question is, can schools narrow the gap? Is yes. But there are two ways to narrow a gap. Either those children do better, or those children do worse. And so actually what we're talking about here is a raising achievement agenda. It's not simply a narrowing the gap agenda. So all the many talks I've done as Pupil Premium Champion over the last 2 years have been called effectively raising achievement and closing the gap, which is excellence and equity. And excellence and equity is what should underpin the purpose of all our schools. I love these conferences, and I felt this morning, just as I have felt in all the previous 5 conferences, encouraged, optimistic, and enthused. And the word I heard most often in the conversations that I had with people outside the conference in the break time, lunchtime and so on, was energized. People feel energized by the whole education annual conference, and I hope very much that this session will add to that. There have been 2 really significant reports about Pupil Premium quite recently, a National Audit Office report in July and an NFER report which came out just about a week ago. And both of them were really quite positive. And the NFER report said some really significant things. First of all, both reports said you've got to understand that successful implementation of the pupil premium is different in different schools. It depends what the barriers to learning are of the individual pupils. And it also said, interestingly, that it will take 3 to 5 years to embed. Successful schools told the NFER, and they took the message, it has taken us 3 to 5 years to embed our successful strategies in terms of narrowing the gap. There's no quick fix, which was the subject of a blog that I wrote for the Times Ed last week. And another interesting thing about the NFR is they took a number of different strategies that are commonly used in the narrowing the gap agenda in schools. And they showed how successful schools that they talked to had implemented that strategy and how less successful schools had implemented it. So, for example, on metacognition, which is right up there at the top of the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit, they described a successful school and the way in which they had merged metacognition into their overall teaching strategy and raising the quality of teaching and used pupil voice and etc., etc. And in the unsuccessful school, they said, what's metacognition? So I think the school kind of pupil premium motto that has most resonated with me and which I've used to audiences time and time again, and I will share with you, is that effective implementation of pupil premium is about classroom rigour and individual need. And if you balance those two things with the pupil premium money that you get, you really are on the way to success here. And I've written a blog, it's on my website, summarising the things that I have found in the 2 years that I did Pupil Premium Champion work that successful schools were doing. Absolutely on the button with data. Data in relation to the individual progress of pupils, really frequent monitoring of that progress, and then rapid implementation of strategies that they've got in place to support the individual pupils in whatever the data had produced. An unerring focus on the quality of teaching. That, more than anything, makes a difference, because we know from the Sutton Trust report in 2011 that the quality of teaching disproportionately affects disadvantaged youngsters. If you have poor teaching, that disproportionately disadvantages deprived children. And if you have excellent teaching, that disproportionately benefits them. So the quality of teaching is absolutely at the centre of it. Engaging parents and carers more in the education of the children. A whole range of strategies there. And that 100% buy-in from your staff, which means that not a single member of staff, never mind the teaching staff, not a single member of your staff would dream of saying, well, what would you expect from a child from Corporation Street? Because if you've got even one member of staff that says that, that is seriously undermining your high aspiration, high expectation ethos in your school. And I think one of the greatest things that Pupil Premium has done is it's actually led to us as schools using evidence much more strongly than we have done in the past. From the toolkit, from the experience of successful schools, from the John Hattie work, etc., etc. But nonetheless, within that using of evidence, there has been a massive amount of innovation and creativity that I have observed in the way in which Pupil Premium is spent to respond to the individual needs of pupils. Schools, for example, that have spent Pupil Premium money on a washing machine. Why, you think, would that be? Well, the schools, the small number of schools that I've come across that have done that have been secondary schools that have been really good at drilling down into data, that have been really good at listening to the pupil voice, and that have discovered as a result of that that the attendance pattern, the pattern of poor attendance among their disadvantaged youngsters was all to do with the fact that they didn't have any PE kit. They got given horrible, dirty PE kit, and you can see how you lead on then to buying a washing machine. Another school that had a real problem with attendance. Kids living in tower blocks that they just couldn't get out of bed in the morning. They used Pupil Premium money to lease a minibus so that they could actually get round there, because they recognised that they couldn't make a difference to those kids until they got them into school, and 82% of their Pupil Premium kids get 5 A to C's with English and maths. So, and a primary school that had a fantastic strategy for parental engagement, actually in terms of improving the education and literacy of the parents and paying for them to do that so that they can engage more with the education of their children. So all of that is important. But the other two things in the context of this conference that I want to say to you that I think are really important here in terms of narrowing the gap are, first of all, accountability. If you define your own aims for what you want to do in terms of narrowing the gap, in terms of attainment, progress, attendance, behaviour, whatever it may be, engagement of parents, etc., you set your own accountability targets, and you begin to take ownership of accountability and not simply regard accountability as something that's done to you by those nasty people at Ofsted and DFE league tables and so on. And that's a very, very powerful thing for school leaders to do, to take ownership of accountability and use it to reinforce the achievement of the aims of your school, irrespective of what the national agenda might be. And the final thing is to use the curriculum, to become curriculum developers again, to recognise that the narrower lives that disadvantaged children tend to lead mean that a whole education is that much more significant for disadvantaged youngsters than it is for others. The kind of whole education that parents pay tens of thousands of pounds to send their children to posh independent schools to get actually is of paramount importance to disadvantaged youngsters because of the lives they lead outside school and the narrow opportunities that are very much available to them compared to their peers. Through a whole education, you can bring the advantages of that to them. So, evidence-based strategies, using accountability creatively, and developing the curriculum in your school so that it builds the skills and personal qualities of young people as well as their knowledge are my 3 messages to you this afternoon. Thank you very much.
John, I'm going to ask you the one question. So can you store some questions and just hold it until we've gone right through? The only question I want to ask you is this. If there's a study in America by a man called, I think, Rothstein, who shows that in America, the gap, which we can talk about, stays the same between September and June in America and grows between June and September. And you can see why that would be. And that suggests, doesn't it, that the biggest leakage is in the 80% of time that's outside school. Now, you've talked about making even richer the 20% that's within school. Have you picked up stuff that would be interesting in that 80% outside school?
Oh, absolutely. And a specific priority for a lot of schools has been transition. Whatever, you were talking, David Carter this morning was talking about the different transition phases. Helping disadvantaged children through those transition phases is really, really important. But if you regard each year as a transition to the next, for a start, I don't think we have the right shape of school year, but that's another story. But I think I have seen schools using summer schools and other activities like that to keep positive experiences going through the holidays, through the breaks between traditional school terms. And that, I think, is a very powerful thing for people to do.
Okay. I'm going to stop you there. I mean, I want immediately to carry on, but I won't, which is, you've made a throwaway remark about the pattern of the school year. So can we return to that and others when we get there? I actually now want, I'm feeling really sceptical this afternoon, but not cynical, a lot of difference. So I'm really now hoping that Deborah, who has fallen in love with Shanghai, is going to convince me that context is going to not become an issue and that Shanghai has such a lot to teach us so far as maths is concerned.
Thank you. I've been in the fortunate position of having visited Shanghai, having worked closely with probably 60 primary teachers in Shanghai, brought them to England, put them in our classrooms, take them out of their culture, put them into our culture to see if it would work. I'm just picking up on one small element that has challenged my practice as a teacher, as a head teacher, worked for a local authority, all sorts of things in my career, but we often assume things that are good practice. And one of the things that we assume is good practice is differentiation. It's one of probably the most key closing the gap strategies. Let's actually drill down and meet the needs of individual groups of children. And we've gone down that road, and it seems the more we've gone down that road, the more differentiation happens. We start off with a class, we might have 2 groups. Oh, well, this group's going a bit slower than this one, we'll split it again. Or our bottom group's a bit, they're really not ready to move on, we'll split it again. I went into a class the other day and there were 11 levels of differentiation. And that's been our inclusion strategy in the main, has been to slow the red group down in order that they can catch up. And so they're slowed down to catch up. That, for a start, hampers a growth mindset. If I'm in the red group, can I really believe that I can achieve as well as the turquoise group? And the reality is, and data shows this, that children in the red group are very often still in the red group by the time they reach year 6. And the gap has just widened. It's widened and widened. And it's quite typical in a year 6 class at the moment that there are children from level 1, the old level 1, through to level 6. That's quite the norm. We're the only country in the world where the year 3 teacher is not only expected to teach the year 3 curriculum, but they're expected to teach the year 4 curriculum maybe for some, the year 2 curriculum for others, maybe the year 5 curriculum, maybe the year 1 curriculum. The difficulty for that is that it's too hard for children. When children are in a math lesson, and it's the mathematics perspective I'm coming from, they need their teacher to be focused on their mathematics for 100% of the time. Not diluted dealing with the turquoise group and the orange group and the indigo group and the red group and eventually get back to the turquoise group. It's also become too hard for the teacher. If a mastery lesson, and this is what we're talking about deep and sustainable learning, and I think there is an issue with deep and sustainable learning. I'm sure many of you can equate to the scenario that you teach something, you come back to it maybe 6-8 weeks later as the curriculum spirals, and you come out of that lesson, you go into the staff room at break time and you say, feels like I'm starting again. Taught them that 8 weeks earlier, and it's gone. It feels like I'm starting again, so I'm having to reteach. And so it's hard for the teacher. A lesson for the teacher needs to be the best lesson he or she can teach. If they're being diverted with my umpteen levels of differentiation and having to juggle all of that and look into the year 4 curriculum, look into the year 2 curriculum and bring all that together, they're not giving their best. That most precious resource in the classroom is not being utilised to its full extent. So what I'm going to suggest is that one of the questions might be, well, okay, we can see that mastery, whole class teaching, keeping the class working together at broadly the same pace for longer periods of time. I can guarantee if you're teaching fractions for a week and you start on Monday, I can guarantee most children won't have learned anything sustainable by Friday. So our lower attainers need much longer to embed and for that learning to become deep and sustainable. But what about the higher attainers? Shouldn't we just let them race on? Aren't we limiting them by actually, are we holding them back in a whole class teaching? My argument to that is no. In mathematics, the research shows that actually our higher attainers, by letting them race on, we're doing them a disservice because their learning is too superficial, it's not deep and sustainable. And I've spoken to 2 lecturers at Imperial College London, not only one of the best places to study mathematics in this country, but one of the best places to study mathematics in the world. Do they have trouble with subject knowledge from the students that come to them with their 4 A's, A stars, further maths, etc.? Yes, they do. It's insufficiently deep. We have children who get A's, A stars at GCSE. Some of them give up on A level because they can't cope with it. It's insufficiently deep. So even for our higher attainers, by racing them on, we're actually doing them a disservice and we're stopping them from meeting their potential. So my argument is that they need to go deeper. Other children need time to learn it in a collaborative community in which we're all in it together, we're all helping each other, and we're all learning and gaining and developing and meeting our own potential. Whole class teaching, teaching for mastery, a strategy, alternative strategy to differentiation for closing the gap. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think you're going to get quite a few questions when we get to them. But the one question I would like to ask you, arising from that, is And I agree with lots of it, so let me say straight away that I do. Particularly, by the way, that the red gap will be all summer-born children. Well, they won't be all, but mainly there'll be summer-born children. But when you use the word deeper, what did you mean? Give me a for example.
An example of going deeper is that, just a very simple example, is that I not only can do multiplication, I not only might know my tables, but I also deeply understand the concept of multiplication, and I can relate multiplication to division. I can relate division of division being about fractions, and I can relate finding finding a fraction of something. I can relate fractions to being about division. So it's that deep conceptual knowledge, but it's not only that. I would say it's fluency. I would say it's conceptual fluency as well as procedural and factual fluency. It's all three of those. What do I need to know to be successful in mathematics? I need to know that. I need to know the 7/8 of 56. I need to know how. I need to know how to find the area of a rectangle, for example. I need to know why that area works. That formula works, because if I don't know why that formula works, then actually I'm hampered in applying that formula and being fluent with it.
Okay, and just to finish it, because I think I'm allowed to finish this one,
Okay.
because I will be asking about that. Well, in your description, would I be differentiating between your needs, who I know can go into that conceptual understanding, and John's needs, who has always struggled with 7/8?
Yes, I would say all children need all three. I'm not differentiating between those three areas, because actually, if I understand in mathematics why something works, I'm going to be more fluent with it, and I'm going to be more efficient with it. Research by Tall and Gray says that our lower attaining children are doing the harder maths, because they've not worked out the easy ways of doing it. So all children need access. Some children will discover it by themselves, but actually our role as teachers is to ensure that all children have access to those deep structures. One of the things about depth is it's not about complexity, it's about simplicity. When you understand something deeply in mathematics, you see it with great clarity and simplicity. Therefore, it's accessible to all children. And if you give children access to that, then it makes the math easier and not harder.
Okay. And then the final question, and I really am horrid because I've given you three, which is, you would say then that the people who taught, and I am so old that I don't know if everybody will pick up on this, John will, the people who taught Ruth Lawrence, who got a degree in mathematics at Cambridge at 17, they did a disservice.
Well, Ruth Lawrence would probably say they did. She hasn't had the same road for her children. So she would agree that actually they did do her a disservice.
Right, okay. Good. Right, well, okay. I'm ambivalent on this, and I'm feeling deeply guilty because I once got a school in Birmingham that was a primary school to do mathematics at GCSE level, and they did it in dozens of children getting grade A's, and the grammar schools, because there were still grammar schools in Birmingham, came along to me and said, well, now what are we going to do with them? And I said, well, you're going to bore them like you were boring them in the past, but now you'll know you're boring them. But Natasha, you have a winning message to tell us, which everybody is going to look forward to hearing from. You come from the Policy Exchange, and you wrote that amazing report, or you're credited with that amazing report, about fining schools. That is right, isn't it? So if you could come and tell us about the idea of fining schools.
I wasn't going to talk about that at all.
No, I don't blame you. I don't blame you,
I can
Natasha.
do. And the word fine doesn't appear on the report at all. It's a levy, and it's for further education rather than punishing the schools. Today's my last day at Policy Exchange, and it's my last day before I become a civil servant. So I can say things that I won't be able to say tomorrow, and that perhaps I wasn't supposed to say yesterday. So that's quite good fun, a bit, although I can't annoy my new employers who are who are the civil service. So I'm going to try and strike a balance between those two things. I just found it fascinating listening to the two talks before me, and I feel a little bit intimidated by that. My background is I've been in policy exchange for just over a year. Before that, I was a senior leader. I was an assistant head teacher at a school called King Solomon Academy, which I was also a founding teacher at. And before that, I did 3 years in a maintained school on Teach First. So King Solomon Academy was set up specifically to address this advantage. We were obsessed with not narrowing the gap. We would have said that that was low expectations. We were obsessed with closing the gap, and built a school that we wanted to do that with. It currently we have 76% of children on free school meals, pupil premium, 58% free school meals, and it is the highest performing school in terms of GCSE results in the country this year. 93% A star to C, and given our initial motivations, I would say that still isn't good enough. So that's my background schools-wise. So I think it's a really good point. We don't want the top to kind of drop down, but I think there needs to be a desire to pull the bottom up, and there needs to be a belief that it's possible. I went to an event last year, and at the end they had a vote about can you ever close the gap, and more than 50% said no, you can't in this vote. And maybe if you look at the evidence, I don't know, maybe that is true, but what an awful way to think. I think we have to believe it's possible, and we have to fight for it. And in doing so, we might not get there, but at least we'll get close, and that's really important. I think there's a moral imperative to do that. So in terms of closing the gap, what does that mean? I'm going to be talking from an academic viewpoint. There was an interesting study last year by the Impetus PEF Foundation, supported it, and that found that the one single common factor between NEETs is whether they have a C grade in English and Maths GCSE. It's not poverty, it's not parental education, it's not any of the things that I might have thought it was. It's if they have an English or Maths GCSE. And to me that means, we can argue about whether that should be the right measure, but if that's what happens to children who don't get that qualification, we need to be making that a priority. I think there's real good news in this debate. I think the top schools are innovating. I think the best schools are doing amazing things. Some school chains now have a reverse gap. So poorer children outperform wealthier children. There's schools like Mossbourne, like King Solomon Academy, where you've got lots of kids on free school meals doing very, very well academically. I think there is some amazing practice happening in the UK, and that's really exciting, and it's good news. I also think we've got focused teacher routes into teacher recruitment routes like Teach First that are focused on closing the gap. It's a mission that people are being brought into, and I think that's really exciting. Generally, I think there's higher expectations. There's been policy changes to focus on more academic curriculums for all children. In my first school, there was lots of children like these kind of comments. I just don't think people believe that so much anymore. I think there's a kind of mission-driven alignment, which is really exciting. I think Pupil Premium is a brilliant initiative. I know some schools perhaps don't use it so well. I think where it is used well, it's extraordinary. And I've seen some schools doing amazing things with it and helping to close the gap with it. I think if we look at the academics, there's a lot more research into what the gap is. And it's not just getting kids GCSEs, despite me having said that, but it isn't. It's about them getting into university. It's about them graduating from university. Actually, what it's really about is them having a good life, getting a good job, being able to support their family, all of those things. And I think that there's more academic research into that. That's exciting. And the media are interested. This morning I opened up my daily what's going on in the world of education in the media. And, there were 3 stories this morning in the press about closing the gap, disadvantaged students not doing well enough at school. And that was making it, pretty high up in the media interest. And that's a really good news story, I think. So there are some good things happening. So where do we go to next, and where do the gaps still exist? I only left school a year and a half ago, and when I left school, there were a lot of cuts happening to services that surround schools that would help mop up some of the pastoral issues that some of these most disadvantaged children have. They're disappearing, and as the funding for those is disappearing, schools are having to pick up more and more. And I think partly schools don't have the capacity to do that, but also don't have the expertise. As a teacher, having to deal with issues that actually a professional social worker or mental health worker should have to deal with, I think either there needs to be kind of upskilling of of teachers into that area, if that's something we want to do, or there needs to be a rethinking about how the funding works in those areas. Secondly, I think early years, there's still a real confusion about what early years policy is for. Is it about providing somewhere for young children to go so parents can get back into the workplace, and really who cares about the quality? Or is it about addressing those disadvantaged young children who by the age of 3, there's already a gap between them and their wealthier peers? Is it about quality for disadvantaged really young kids? I think a lot of school reform has been focused on urban communities, and I don't just think that's England. I think if you look at the States, if you look at Massachusetts, that's really where a lot of the school improvement has been for disadvantaged kids. And actually more and more coastal areas, rural areas are where our attention needs to be. I'm not sure it's the same solution. America's doing some work in Las Vegas, I know at the moment, which is interesting, but when they're applying urban solutions to rural contexts, it's not having quite the same effect. So I think that's an issue we need to address. Almost finally, I think a kind of a focus on higher expectations, so thinking about destination data instead of just getting a C at GCSE, I think is really important, and hopefully we'll get that data. And earlier intervention. National Literacy Trust have this project in the Midlands where they work with the health service, so when people are giving birth, going into hospital to kind of give birth, actually, perhaps when you're giving birth, you don't want all of this, but they have someone there who talks you through how to develop the language skills and math skills of your child through the early years. I think it's with the midwife before. I can't imagine in a hospital being like, just pause your pushing and listen to this. But I think that kind of thing, that joining up with health service, that's really important because schools can only do so much when, you know, if you're in secondary and at primary, when they're arriving already so far behind, you end up having to do heroics in the school sector. And that's my final point, that I think there's still an issue with sustainability in all of this. And actually, you know, King Solomon Academy got amazing results, but it did it by heroics, by crazy long school days, by really long school terms, by drilling out some of the curriculum and just focusing really narrowly on trying to close the gap. And is that sustainable? Well, you know, if children are arriving at 11 years old, already very far behind their equivalent peers in independent schools or in kind of from wealthier backgrounds, you've got to do heroics to catch up. And I think we've got to start thinking way, way earlier, even earlier perhaps than 2, where the government is now, right back to working with the health services at the very beginning to try to close that gap. So I didn't talk about the levy, but there's a lot of shouting at me on Twitter about it from a couple of months ago, if you want to look it up, and you can also have a look at the report. Thanks.
Very much. Well, I shall resist asking you about the levy and just simply say one of the things that you said and John said was about language. I mean, John actually referred to children, I think you said from Corporation Street or wherever it was, and you referred to, actually in one occasion, you referred to these children. I wonder, was there anything about the language you used at King Solomon with the children that would make them feel they were, because you believed they could, and you must have communicated it to the children, were there any thoughts about language that you used in order that they should think that?
Yeah, I think language is really important, and I think Carol Dweck's work on fixed mindset and growth mindset is really interesting, and the idea that, you know, if you believe you can, it's a bit kind of Disney, but actually it works. I think a large part of what we did was try to normalize. So I think we did a huge amount around language. We tried to create a kind of language of the school. When you start a new school and you've got no history, that's quite challenging. So we tried to have words that were KSA words, and then you kind of try and create community through language. I think normalizing the names of universities was very important, so that they knew what different universities were called and where they were, and never saying, you know, I think always believing that someone can do well is really important, and I think it's really, I think people do these days. I think it's much more accepted. But I think using language to say that is really important.
And the one other thing to mention is there was a time, I try never to say that, but there was a time when the health service had first parent health visitors who did exactly the role that you were making a plea for from birth through to in their work with young, particularly mothers, obviously, and those days, but fathers as well. So that will be an answer to some of your queries.
I know there's a school at the moment that's looking at getting a GP on site and also looking at getting a social worker who they can have as part of their leadership team and feed into the line management of. I think that is really, that's really important, joining up those services.
Yeah, absolutely sure. I'm certain you're right about language. Now, I'm going to stand up and I hope that I've got a few people who are going to ask questions or give a view so that any of the three can pick up on it. Make it as direct as you like. Could you put your hands up? And there's one over there. So if we could go there, and if there's somebody else who will want to follow that person, could we... over there, right.
One of the things I've been thinking about for a while at our school is the idea of using the early years premium to do exactly that kind of role that was just being discussed, to support families almost from birth. I love the idea of them being in the ward. So we have been trying to tackle our families before they become our families, because ultimately they're all in our community. I don't mind whether they go to our school or the school that's a mile up the road. I want those families to be successful. And I think that one of the biggest impoverishments facing our families is language, and the children that are struggling who come in with the gap are the children who have that language gap. And for me, the pupil premium and the early years premium, the amounts are the wrong way round, because actually if we can have more money earlier, then potentially as schools, we can do some quite innovative stuff and create roles where people can go out, build the trust within their community and work with our families, because some of our families are very isolated. They're not with their parents and their grandparents anymore like they used to be. So I think there should be a drive to get that money earlier, in larger amounts earlier, because actually, although it will take a long, long time to filter through the system, ultimately those children will be in a better place if we can increase the language environment they live in.
And would either... Yes, John will react. Everybody react if you feel like it.
Just very quickly, you'll all be familiar, I'm sure, with the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit. There is an early years toolkit, and the top in terms of effectiveness in the early years toolkit is clearly support with language development is the best way to spend that money.
Yeah. And while have we got somebody over here? We have.
Thank you. I'm the first person to say that there are real heroics going on in a lot of English schools, as you mentioned, Natasha, to try and close the gap. And I think we can narrow the gap, but I think we need to take a slightly broader view, because we need to take a system view as well. And that's where it gets controversial. And I think if you look at the work of the OECD about systems that are the most equitable, you'll find certain characteristics of them which our system sadly often doesn't have. One of them is about ensuring actually that the Shanghai model, that we don't get kids stuck in kind of repeating endless skills that they're not achieving in. That's one of them, and that happens, I think, a lot in some of our schools. But also it's about the nature of the market in education and how we need to, as a country, start managing that far more and intervening in it far more, because of the kind of, some parents, some students going to particular schools for very different reasons than we would necessarily want them to. And also it's about the curriculum and the assessment system that we've brought into. Now, I know your New Visions group has come out saying how dangerous the new assessment system is in terms of narrowing the gap. We've got a system where 30% of the students at GCSE are almost bound to fail. They may be different, they may go up and down to different schools, but they're bound to because of the nature of the kind of normative assessment that has been built in, and that needs to change. And we also need to ensure, and I think this is where I slightly disagree with what Natasha was saying, one of the other characteristics is a secondary school curriculum with some choices, with some options, which build on students' strengths. And actually that has also gone to a large degree from our system. So I think we need, as well as to celebrate what's brilliantly working in schools, we need to be working together to change some of these system approaches that are being imposed on us.
Any comment on that? John in particular will have a comment on it, and could we get the microphone to that?
Indeed. I mean, what I've tried to do over the last couple of years is to give people, if you like, a system approach to the methodology of dealing with the gap and the disadvantages of deprived youngsters. But within that methodology, actually to recognise that there will be different solutions in different schools. I often recall an executive head of two primary schools coming to see me at one of these conferences and saying to me, I have exactly the same strategies in these two schools that I had, and they work in one but not in the other. He hadn't gone back, as it were, to the barriers to learning and recognised that those were different for the individual pupils in the school. So this very much has to relate, as I said, to individual need of the youngsters, but alongside that, classroom rigour and, yes, a fair deal with curriculum, which I think is where whole education comes in.
Deborah, and then Natasha, do you want...
I think we have real issues with curriculum. If looking at China, when I compared where the children were and where content was introduced into the curriculum, that in grades 1, 2, 3, they seemed a bit behind our children. They really slow down introduction of concepts and ideas. For example, they only teach addition and subtraction in grade 1. And they are our year 2 children. And so they really slow things down, go really deeply, really embed deep and sustainable learning. But by the time they reach the end of primary school, they're way ahead of where our children were. I think there's a misconception that the earlier you introduce something in the curriculum, the better the children will be. And I think it's actually the opposite. And I think there are issues with early years curriculum and our Key Stage 1 curriculum, and we need to be careful.
Natasha, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think it's. I think I agree with what you say. I think it's important qualifications have workplace value, and I think getting rid of equivalent qualifications in some subjects that were perhaps very interesting, but then didn't have value further on, I think was good, just to not waste people's time doing qualifications. But I also think what's really interesting is this idea that a school that is very academic and does very well doesn't do anything outside of that. And I'm not sure that you can get incredible results by not doing everything. I'm not sure you can get a child to do really well by not finding what their special strength, what their special thing is, and helping them develop that. And equally, this whole thing about, schools that are rigorous and academic, not focusing on children's well-being. I know there are exceptions in the independent sector that get pointed out to me, but my experience of working with disadvantaged kids in schools that are trying to get great academics is if the kid has a really big issue going on at home, they are not going to do well at school if they're not well supported pastorally. So this whole notion that kind of pastoral and academic are separate, and it may well be the case in the independent sector. I've been given examples of eating disorders in high-performing public schools, but my experience is if a kid's having a rough time at home and they're not being supported at all by school, it slips into the classroom. So I think you've got to have broads in order to do well on the narrow, I guess.
Okay. We've got time for one more question from whoever it was had the microphone.
I've got the microphone here.
Yeah, okay.
This is probably going to be going back and kind of covering old ground again, so maybe it's not the best question to finish on. But I really sort of listened to what this gentleman was saying about the systemic pressures, and it seems like we've got an incredibly fragmented system. Well, we do have an incredibly fragmented, it doesn't seem like it is. And I come from an early years background, and the directions that we're being squashed and pulled in, I mean, we're going in an incredibly dangerous direction at the moment, where children we're doing things earlier, as you said, and we're forcing children into desks earlier. We're doing all of these assessments. We're putting all these pressures on the system that is really dangerous. And I was really curious just to get some ideas from you guys, because you are in a position where you do have more influence and you are shaping the system, but you know, there are people that have the same ideas about, you know, narrowing the gap and closing, you know, so that achievement is more equal, but it seems like we're going in so many different directions to get around. There is no unification within the space.
Yes, I'm sure that the early emphasis is a kind of, there's an internal contradiction with what we're trying to achieve, especially as you describe rather nicely what's happening in Shanghai and earlier success, and the illustration you gave of people not succeeding. I'm going to give a last word to each of you and then I'm going to stop you.
Yeah, I mean, I just repeat what I've said. I do think we need to look again at the early years curriculum, and teachers need to use the freedoms that they do have within the constraints of the curriculum. I think a lot of the schools I work with, the foundation stage is about knowing. Technically, we have no numbers to 20, but good foundation stage teachers are looking deeply at numbers to 10. And then visiting the ones to the numbers to 20. I do have some concerns about the announcement that maybe Key Stage 1 tests now coming in more formally are going to be harder, and I feel that actually we need a voice there, because actually if they are harder, we could actually inhibit children's progress rather than actually enhance it.
Yeah, it would be very, very helpful, given that you are an advocate of the Shanghai system, for you to make that pretty clear to the government, because otherwise I think they're going to want to live with their internal contradictions. And Natasha?
I think perhaps less, you know, I've got less experience in the early years in a kind of, in a practitioner way, but I think the response of some schools to policies that are kind of, I guess, trying to raise expectations on a policy stage, you know, using laws to try and raise standards. And I think some schools respond to that, some leadership teams respond to that in a kind of panicked way, where they throw out all the stuff that's working well and try and meet those needs. I mean, like the example of let's forget about the pastoral because we're just going to focus on the academic. And I think it kind of misses the broader point of what a good education looks like. So I think actually a lot of the responsibility is about leadership, and I think really good leadership, you know, a really good school leader, I know a very good school leader who's got early years and primary in his school, and he did kind of have them behind desks in, you know, reception, and it was all very, and actually he found their results weren't as successful, so he's got rid of all of that. So I think good school leaders will do what works and will kind of ignore the noise and believe in that.
John, last word to you.
I think it was Mahatma Gandhi that said something like, you should judge a society by how it treats its most unfortunate citizens. And I think schools should be judged by how well they do with their most disadvantaged pupils.
I think that's a very good note to end on.